Power Breakfast. Top talk of the morning.
Meanwhile, also in parliamentary news, the president has now signed a new proclamation when it comes to political party funding. After years and years and years of organizations and NGOs fighting for a lot more transparency and declarations of funding, we now have the president perhaps taking a step back here. So changing the thresholds, for example, from 15 million per donor per year that parties can get to 30 million, and just changing the parameters there, making it easier for political parties to get more money. Is this a good thing or is it a bad thing? Joining us on the line at the moment is Mmusi Maimane, who is the president of BOSA. Is it president or leader of BOSA? I know these designations matter, Mmusi, in the world of politics.
Chief Builder.
Chief Builder. There we go. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, Mmusi. Your thoughts on the president's decision to now change these parameters in terms of where funding or how much funding a party can get? Who does it benefit and who does it harm?
Well, good morning and good morning to fellow South Africans. I mean, first and foremost, the law itself is operating within a system that is fundamentally flawed. As I've argued before, that elections are going to become more and more expensive. And ultimately, it means that influential people will look to buy, if you like, political party influence through all sorts of mechanisms. The reality of it is that until we amend the Electoral Act to make it easier for people to campaign within constituencies, then you wouldn't need to raise all of these thresholds. Because if all I have to do is campaign only in Joburg, then I don't need 30 million rand. I just need, I might need 1 million rand to run an effective campaign if I was standing in a constituency of Joburg. And so until we amend that, we are always going to see this discussion continue. On the actual merit of where the president increases the threshold or not, the difficulty of it is that it suits parties that are already the much bigger parties, if you like, the institutionalized parties, because they have access to major donors and major funding can come through and keep increasing. Whereas for new entrants, new ideas, new political parties, this becomes extraordinarily hard. And the last question which is this issue of transparency. Whilst I appreciate that all South Africans want to know who funds whom, I do think some of this discussion must be had with the IEC, where parties must be able to come to the IEC and make declarations. The interest here is to make sure that at the end of the day, no one has influence beyond the process of an election itself, but that they can fund a party in order to get a contract, and then that contract is used to make proceeds that funds the party. If that triangle continues, then you end up with state capture. But what we desperately need as citizens is as much declaration and as much accountability and an empowerment of the IEC to be able to interrogate these issues.
So, Mmusi, you are now an MP, so of course the mandate for changing the way that the electoral laws work actually stands and sits within Parliament. It begins and ends with you. The IEC has a role around, management and regulation. But what steps could be taken within Parliament to start us down the journey of the kind of reforms you're talking about, both in terms of the electoral system, but also in terms of a lot more transparency?
Well, I think on the first instance is that there's already been a processing of a different electoral amendment bill. I know that the Home Affairs Portfolio Committee is seized with the matter. At its fundamental core is that we have to make a very important decision, which is how much do we retain as proportionality and how much do we enhance as direct election? In other words, how do we create constituency-based model? And that debate is taking place right now. And hopefully that Parliament will not just comply with the Constitutional Court challenge we brought forward by maliciously saying, oh, well, like they did last year, let's just allow independence to stand. This was never about independence. It's about making sure that the people hold their members of Parliament accountable. And then I do think there needs to be, apropos your previous question to your previous caller, which is what is the maximum contribution a party can have? I do think that must be part of the conversation, because in many ways, you can't have the distortion of the golden rule where he who has the gold eventually rules. and eventually whoever can raise the most amount of money ultimately becomes the government.
Yeah.
It simply cannot be that. And so, a bit like other jurisdictions all over the world, there is a capping upon which you can spend on electoral issues, so that it stops becoming about the purchasing of power rather than the sharing of ideas and populating those within the population.
And so, Mmusi, what you are calling for is more constituency-based voting. Some might argue that going towards a constituency-based system may actually, be to the detriment of smaller parties. If I think of a party like the ANC is probably one of the only parties that has a fully fledged ward-based system, for example, in terms of branches in every ward. Would they not then be able to capitalize on that? So the combination of their resources and their reach make it harder for, smaller entrants or smaller parties or individuals at those ward levels?
No, I think the converse is true, because it is precisely because at local government we have a ward-based system that the ANC has struggled, because you find when there's direct accountability, where a ward councillor has to respond or a PR councillor has to respond to the people, when public representatives cannot do that, it's become quite clear that parties who abuse their power eventually lose. But and it would be the same in a provincial and a national election, because in a national election, the competencies of national government are, as they speak to security, healthcare, and education. When a hospital, a police station, and presumably a school doesn't work, a member of parliament must respond. And I would argue, in that context, the big parties who would have to then come and explain to the people why those things are not working would be held accountable. And so I hold the view that it would be beneficial to someone who is saying, I want to be accountable to the people and I will work to fight against these issues that pertain to national government. So, and to the point that this argument is really about, not only is it about accountability, but it's about making sure that the funding is appropriate, because when it's said and done, campaigning in a smaller geography with all the infrastructure that you need around a campaign is far cheaper than what you get when you get big parties on a PR list who simply just put up a front in the person of the president or the deputy, and then you don't know who sits below that list.
Yeah.
All that can just become a money issue that eventually benefits those who haven't even campaigned.
And maybe a final provocation here, Mmusi, around this question of funding and your thought about constituencies. We are not a country that has a culture of what they call in the US or the UK small dollar donations or small pound donations, small rand donations into parties. We used to have more of a culture within the ANC, the EFF, of membership as the core funding, but it doesn't seem that the membership funding model is as pure as it used to be or as useful. Is there a space for conversation nationally about having small dollar donations and having people actually contribute directly from their own pockets to the candidates they want? I'm thinking about Zordan Mamdani here, who raised billions, it seems, just through the people who support them. Is that the direction we should go?
Completely. And I think the probability of that happening arises itself when all of us as citizens know who we are voting for, not what. Because the dilemma that citizens have to confront is to say, if I just fund this party and do whatever, it would feel as though that party can do as it pleases. Whereas, to come back to the constituency drum I'm beating, which is to say, if I know Mmusi Maimane is standing in Johannesburg and he will be my member of parliament, and then after he's elected as a member of parliament, will come back to me and sit in an office in the community to respond to my issues, suddenly my funding is not just benevolent 10 rand or 50 rand that I'm making to his campaign. It's also a social contract that says to him, I do expect for you to come and give me feedback, and therefore the relationship is established.
So you're accountable to me, not to the big donors or the people who are sitting there, with big pockets. I think that's a really interesting one. And maybe the Power listeners could tell us, would you be willing to fund fund political parties directly out of your pocket if it meant that it would counteract the big donors and their influence. I think that's one of the conversations worth having. But thank you so much. Dr. Mmusi Maimane, somebody just reminded me, one of the listeners reminded me, it is Dr. Maimane. Thank you so much for joining us this morning and provoking us on that conversation.